Hello and welcome back. This is section 2 of the workshop, Property Legislation. As we said in the introduction to section 1 of this workshop, the program is designed primarily for those who work in the residential areas of sales and property management in New South Wales. And what we're going to do is examine some of the key provisions of the main legislation that you experience every day, and that's the Property Stock and Business Agents Act and the Residential Tenancies Act. There is, of course, other key legislation for those who work in areas such as commercial sales and leasing and strata management. We've provided copies of their key legislation in the Resources section. The Property Stock and Business Agents Act. Some of the key areas that this Act covers, it provides for the licensing and registration of real estate agents and salespeople. Other areas covered under the Act are business practices and supervision. It's worth noting that under Section 32 of the Act, licensees must effectively supervise those employees engaged in the business. And licensees are required to establish procedures and ensure those procedures are followed. The Director-General has issued guidelines for the procedures which you will need to establish if you've not already done so. And remember, it is a requirement that you have those procedures in place, and a requirement that if you are the licensee, that you ensure that those procedures are followed. So you do need to check. Other key areas of the Act include Section 46, agents giving financial and investment advice. This area is so important that Section 10 of the regulations further expands on the financial and investment advice that agents can give and the limits on giving that kind of advice. And you should read those sections which you will find in the Resources section of this workshop. Section 47 of the Act places requirements on agents to disclose any relationship or any benefit they may receive by referring buyers or sellers to third parties, such as solicitors, valuers, mortgage brokers. If you have any kind of business, family or fiduciary relationship with any of those people to whom you refer buyers or sellers, you do need to disclose it, and it needs to be disclosed on the approved form, whether or not you receive any benefit. If in addition you receive a benefit, that too needs to be disclosed. Section 49 of the Act places restrictions on agents, salespeople, and people they are associated with obtaining a beneficial interest in property. This is where an agent, salesperson or associated person as set out in the Act wishes to purchase a property that is listed with the agency. Section 49 sets out a procedure that must be followed, including gaining the vendor's approval on an approved form for the purchase to proceed. There are very severe penalties for not following these correct procedures. Part 4 of the Property Stock and Business Agents Act sets out the requirements regarding agency agreements, and it is worth noting that if your agency agreement is not compliant, or if it's not correctly completed, the agent is not entitled to any commission or expenses that may be incurred under that agreement. Part 5, Division 1 of the Act refers to contracts for the sale of residential property. And it makes a requirement that the agent must have a copy of all the required documents, that is, the contract for the sale of the land, in their possession. Not only before they commence marketing, but also before they indicate to any prospective purchaser so that the property may be coming up for sale or for auction at a future date. So before you begin any marketing, you must have a copy of the contract in your possession. Division 3 of Part 5 refers to false representations to sellers and buyers. This relates to the practice of overquoting to sellers in order to secure the listing, or underquoting to buyers about what you think the selling price might be, especially in the case of upcoming auctions. These are very serious offences. Part 6 of the Act refers to auctions generally. Part 7 of the Act sets out the requirements for the proper keeping of trust accounts and should be read in conjunction with your procedures for trust accounting to ensure you have sufficient procedures in place to safeguard funds that have been entrusted to your agency. Part 8 of the Act refers to records and record keeping by agents and inspection of those records by the Office of Fair Trading. This is by no means an exhaustive exploration of the Property Stock and Business Agents Act, but rather a short glimpse of some key provisions that come up in our daily practice. We recommend that you and your team regularly review sections of the Act to ensure compliance with all parts of the legislation. Let's move on to the Residential Tenancies Act, and again we'll glimpse at some key parts of the Act and look at the areas that are generally covered under that legislation. The Act governs the relationship between landlords and tenants of residential property in New South Wales. Some of the matters covered in the Act are the terms of the agreement, the rights and obligations of landlords and tenants, rent and other payments, the occupation and use of the premises. The landlord's right to enter the premises is set out in the Act, and also obligations on both parties regarding repairs and maintenance of the property. The area regarding alterations and additions to residential premises is also set out in the Act, as is security and safety of residential premises. Part 4 of the Act addresses changes of landlord or tenant. And Part 5 sets out how residential tenancy agreements may be terminated in New South Wales. Division 4 of that part, abandonment of residential premises. What do you do when the tenant has abandoned the premises? Part 8 of the Act sets out all the information you need to know about rental bonds. Part 9, the powers of the tribunal. Division 2 also sets out the requirements regarding tenancy databases. Some key points that you may not be aware of in the New South Wales Residential Tenancies Act are as follows. The tenant cannot be required to have the carpets professionally cleaned at the end of a tenancy, except where animals have been kept at the premises. The landlord cannot require the tenant to pay more than 2 weeks' rent in advance unless the tenant agrees. There is a minimum criteria to be met before the landlord can charge the tenant for water usage. These criteria include the premises must be separately metered. Charges must not exceed the amount the landlord is billed for water usage, and water saving advices as set out in the Act must be installed in the property. The Act sets out some information that must be disclosed to tenants prior to them entering into a tenancy agreement. Tenants must be told whether the premises have been subject to flooding or a bushfire in the past 5 years, whether the premises are subject to significant health or safety risks that are not apparent to a reasonable person on inspection of the premises. This must be disclosed. If the residential premises have been the scene of a serious violent crime within the last 5 years, you must tell the tenant prior to them entering into a residential tenancy agreement. Council waste services, if they are provided to the tenant on a different basis to that that's generally applicable to residential premises within the area of council, you must also notify the tenant before they enter into the agreement. If, because of the zoning of the land and other laws applying to development of the property, the tenant will not be able to get a residential parking permit in an area where only paid parking is available also must let the tenant know before they enter into the agreement. Also, if there's the existence of a driveway or walkway on the residential premises which other people are legally entitled to use, then also the tenant must be notified before they enter into the agreement. This is only a very brief overview of the Residential Tenancies Act, and we do encourage you, before you move on to the assessments in this section, to read through the Residential Tenancies Act that you'll find in the resource section.